So this is our second video in our population unit. This one we're going to talk about a specific example. We're going to talk about the country of Ethiopia. If you look up on the map up in the top right, here is Ethiopia. Excuse me. Here is Ethiopia in Eastern Africa, right next to the Middle East. Here's Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen down here. So it's right here in Eastern Africa. Okay, so let's go back and do some review. We know birth rate, or BR, is the number of live births per 1,000 people in a population per year. Notice that Ethiopia, we already know, is the 14th highest per their 2014 data. But I give you several different, about 14 years worth of birth rates, and notice over those 14 years, not all of them are the same. Again, it's not a steady line, a steady trend. Sometimes it goes up, but here in 2003, 2004, 2005, 6, 7, up until about 2008, it actually then goes back down. Up in 2008, it's increasing again, and then 2013, 14, it goes down. So notice just that birth rates don't have to be steady in any one direction, up or down. It's going to, within years, sometimes go up and down. So again, let's look at death rate. Same thing from 2000 to 2014. Again, notice it changes. Some changes the last half of this information from about 2008 to 2014, there seems to be quite a drop in the death rate. And so that means that people, again, are living longer lives, living healthier lives. So it could have something to do, we'll look at later, with causes. So just remember that information a little bit later. Okay, so again, practice. Take the death rate, DR, and the birth rate, subtract those two, and I want you to find the natural rate of increase, the RNI, for Ethiopia for the years 2012, 13, and 14. I'll pause the video, and when you come back, we'll talk about the answers. So, the rate of natural increase for 2012 should have been, find 2012, 42.59, and down here on the death rate, 10.79. You subtract those two numbers and you got a number like 31.8. So 31.8 for 2012. 2013 should be 29.2, and 2014 should be 29.14. So notice that those are, again, fairly large rates of natural increase. People are having lots of babies. The population is growing fairly rapidly in Ethiopia. Compare that to, remember, Kenya was around, I think, 20, 22. Cambodia was about 18, something like that. So Ethiopia is a very high rate of natural increase, great population growth. Okay, again, a little bit of review. Population density. Here is the number for population density for Ethiopia. Again, what does this not tell us? It doesn't tell us necessarily where people live in the country. So there could be concentrations of people in cities, and then large areas that are fairly unpopulated, but the population density, again, is this number where we theoretically spread everybody evenly out across the country into square boxes. It also, this number doesn't necessarily tell if it's crowded or if it's overcrowded, too many people, or even if it's the country is overpopulated. right? So it doesn't tell us this information, where people are concentrated exactly, if the nation is over populated, too many people for the resources or anything like that. But the numbers do tell us generally that it's a fairly densely populated country, right? If you had a square box, 1 kilometer square each way, 87 people would be in this box. So you'd have to fit 87 people in that square kilometer. That's a lot of people. So now we need to look at the causes of this high rate of population growth, right? So Ethiopia has a high rate of population growth. Excuse me. So Ethiopia has a high rate of population growth. So what are the causes of a high rate of population growth? Well, on one end, we'll talk about death rate later, but first off, you have to have a high birth rate. So we saw that Ethiopia does have a high birth rate, so that fits with Ethiopia. What are some of the reasons why that Ethiopia has a high birth rate? But generally, these can be looked at in many different countries, not only Ethiopia, but I'm going to give you some specific reasons and examples from Ethiopia below. So this first section is going to be about generally what causes high birth rates. The first cause for us is early marriages. When couples, when a husband and wife, a man and a woman get married younger, at a younger age, they have a longer time to have more children. Traditionally, they'll have larger families because they have more time. If you think about it, if you put a woman's life on a timeline, for example, and here is maybe the age of 16, 20, 30, 40, right? So if a woman were to get married at 16, she would have all these years to traditionally have children in a marriage, from 16 to possibly 40 or 50, when most women's bodies will begin to stop having children naturally. In other countries, if some women wait maybe till their 30s or 40s, they would have many fewer years where they're able to be fertile and have children, right? So I'm not necessarily saying that women stop having babies after 40, but just for our example, right, that they have fewer years. So let's look specifically at Ethiopia. Ethiopia does have a high rate of early marriages. It has actually one of the highest rates in the world of early marriages. Notice that 1 in 2 girls are married before their 18th birthday. So you would be, in Form 3, would be most of the girls in our class would be married by this time. At least half of you would be married. A little bit scary to think about, but this is something that is a tradition in Ethiopia. 1 in 5 girls is getting married by the age of 15, right? 15.1 years old. So that's an average age for some girls. Why is this? This could have to do with different regions, right? So it differs within Ethiopia between the regions. You can think about cities generally are not going to probably follow this tradition as much. This region in northern Ethiopia is very rural, not as densely populated, fewer cities. So this region is more traditional and is going to have more early marriages than the cities, the larger cities, where people tend to not follow this tradition. So again, in this northern area of Ethiopia, 50% of the girls are married by the age of 15, very early. And here are some reasons why in Ethiopia. It could be pressure from the community, poverty. Families might want the money that The husband might need to pay the family for a dowry in animals or in money, so poverty might be an issue. Lack of education or economic opportunities for people, so women have no other choice if they're not educated and can't go out and get a job somewhere in the city. They have to stay and get married. Or even social customs might mean that women have limited rights to say no. And if you go to this website, girlsnotbrides.org, you'll find this story of Tino's story in Ethiopia. And Tino is actually this girl here. She is actually 11 years old. So she got married when she was 11, and this is her husband. But this is not her child. Don't worry, she didn't have a child at 10 years old. When I said the customs and traditions in Ethiopia, this is one of the traditions. This is actually Tino's sister's husband. And when Tino's sister died, it was the tradition for her to then marry her sister's husband so that she can now help take care of their family, right? So this is actually her sister's child, and she is now married to her sister's husband, even though her sister is dead, and she is now tasked with looking after his family and the children that her sister had while they were married. The second cause for a high birth rate in Ethiopia or any country with a high birth rate could be a preference for sons. So wanting more male children in a family. So again, here's our textbook definition of why, and then we'll look specifically at Ethiopia in just a second. But different societies place importance on male children over female children. You can think of China, where this is in the past, in history, this has been a huge factor that male children are more important than female children. But why? Well, male children are seen as carrying forward the family name, right? So usually when a couple gets married, it's the male name that is kept and the female maiden name is left or taken off. And so male children make sure that the family's traditions and name go forward. In many societies, there's a tradition of parents being cared for by children, and usually the male children. We'll see why this might be important later. Or religious beliefs, right? There might be some societies that say males are more religiously important. And then also in some societies, males are seen as the income providers, the people that make money for the family. So let's look specifically again at Ethiopia. Here are a couple examples, and I give you the resources below that you can also check more information about this. But in Ethiopia, men and women have these clearly defined traditional roles where men are the providers. Think about income, right? They're providing income or money for the family to survive, where women are left at home doing the domestic work, looking after the children, cooking, cleaning, things like that. So a very traditional style of family. Let's look at another example. Men are the ones who are usually the primary income makers, and they're in control of the family's economy and distributing the money for different resources. Women, again, are in charge of the domestic home life, right? Children in Ethiopia are socially required, so the community says it's the children's responsibility. Once they grow up, the parents get old. It's the children's job to then look after the parents when they're old. And so you might find 2 or 3, 4 generations even in one household. But think about that. If the men are the income makers, income providers in a family, why is it going to be more important to have more children as you grow older, right? Because if you have more male children, more male people to go out and make more money, you're going to have better care, right? So the parents are going to be better cared for if you have more males that are able to provide more money. Another cause of high rates of population or high rate of births, high birth rates, is a need for farm labor. So our textbook explanation again is up here. Many people living in developing nations, poorer nations, right? Children are needed to contribute to the family income. A lot of these people, to survive, they're going to need their children to contribute to the income of the family. Farms. Usually most of these people in developing regions, developing countries, are not going to be able to invest in technology, machinery, so you have to use your own hands to farm, your own manual labor, and so children are going to need to contribute to that. So that's an overall explanation. Let's look again then at Ethiopia in particular. In 2014, 18% of Ethiopia's population is urban, meaning they live in cities. Urban, remember, is to live in a city. So if you're good at math, think about what does that mean? How many people are living out in rural areas away from the city? That should be about, if my math is right, 82%, right, of the country is living in rural regions. So out in the countryside. In 1984, the census revealed that Ethiopia's population was 89% rural. So see, from 1984 to 2014, there's not that big of a change in the number of people that are living in the rural areas in the countryside, doing farming, raising animals, things like that. Huge amount of Ethiopia's population lives in the countryside, relying on this source of income, farming. So, what do people do when they live in the countryside? Many of the people in Ethiopia are nomadic or semi-nomadic, so that means that they don't have one set home. They're moving from place to place, usually following animals. Most nomads usually raise animals, and so you have to move them from place to place to find food for the animals. They engage in sedentary agricultural activities, some of them. So they're farmers, basically. They sit on a piece of land and then just grow the same crops over and over again. But then also some people will do sedentary agriculture and then also raise livestock in the highlands. So that means that they might go up, send animals up into more mountainous areas that are a little bit cooler, might have more vegetation, and so leave the animals up there. But what are you going to do? Are you going to leave those animals by themselves? Probably not. So how are children going to be involved in some of these activities? Well, if you have livestock or animals to watch, children are used to watch the animals, to make sure that they're okay. And here's an example over here. Here's a young boy in Ethiopia that's bringing the animals down maybe to his home from the highland. So children are used to watch animals if you're nomadic or you have livestock to watch. Or if you're doing agriculture, right? Children are going to be used on the farm as labor. Remember that most of the labor on these farms is not going to be done by machinery, it's going to be done by hand, and so you're going to need as many people to farm as possible. Again, let's look down at another example. Men do most of the physical taxing activities outside the home. So again, farming, watching the livestock. Notice again, here's another reason why it might be beneficial to have more males, to continue to try and have more children that are males in a family if you're in Ethiopia, because men are doing the hard work, and if you're farming you want as many boys to do that work. Women are staying at home in the domestic sphere. Children are especially on farms are involved in labor, household labor, at an early age, again like our example of the boy at the top. Girls do a lot of the domestic household work. Boys do very little, so you're lucky if you're a boy, you don't have to do most of the household chores, but you're probably going to be put in charge of watching the cows or goats or sheep or whatever type of animals that you have. Okay, so this is the end of our example for Ethiopia, but other reasons, other causes of high birth rates could be, for example, lack of family planning. Now, I don't necessarily know if this is an issue in Ethiopia. I couldn't find the information, but generally, if you see a country with a high birth rate, this could be one of the causes that you could look at. And so what does that mean? People might not have access to education or information about how to learn about how to plan the size of the family that they want. Do they want a smaller family with 2 or 3 children? If they do, how do you stop having more children after you get the family size that you want? How to prevent having more children, right? So if you don't have access to that information or education, you're unable to put those things into practice, and so you just continue to have more children. So now that we talked about high birth rates, the other cause of a high growth rate in populations, or a high rate of population growth, is on the other side a low death rate, right? So people living longer. It doesn't mean that people are not dying, right? It's not that people aren't dying. It just means that people are living a longer life. So here are the causes of low death rates. One of the first causes is better medical and health care, right? Again, here is our textbook definition of why this helps. You might have more hospitals or better quality hospitals and doctors, more technology in those hospitals that are able to treat more diseases and treat them more effectively. Healthcare might be better nutritional knowledge for babies, for example, what kind of foods babies need to eat. But basically, what's healthy food that people need to eat to be healthy, right? The better food that you eat, the healthier food that you eat, you have a better immune system and you're able to fight off more diseases. So this is a huge benefit to populations if they can get information about how to eat healthy. More immunizations or vaccinations to help fight off diseases like the flu virus, to keep people alive. But all of this helps reduce the number of babies that die in a population and prevents diseases that might cause elderly or older people to die earlier, to live longer, better lives, more fruitful lives. Okay, so let's look at some specific information. This one is a little bit hard to figure out with Ethiopia, but I've tried to find some information that might tell us something. We'll look at the physician density. Now, this is not necessarily like the population density. This looks at the number of physicians or doctors per 1,000 people in a population. So Ethiopia in 2007 and 2009, here the physician density, there's 0.02 doctors per 1,000 people. So later you can look this up for Hong Kong, but this is a very, very small number, so there are very few doctors. So what is this really going to mean? Well, what happens if you get sick? Right? If you get a really bad disease and you have to travel a great distance into the city to seek a doctor's help, number one, are you going to live that journey? Are you going to be able to survive that journey into the city, or are you going to die on the way because of the illness? The further you have to travel, the longer it's going to be to get help. Or if you do have an illness, you might choose, well, I choose not to travel that great distance because I know I'm going to die. And so diseases or illnesses that could be prevented might kill more people because of a lack of doctors, a lack of hospitals possibly in Ethiopia. But let's look at a positive. So even though there's so few doctors, why is the death rate low in Ethiopia? Well, let's look at the rate of immunizations from the World Health Organization in Ethiopia. Let's look in 1994 up to 2003. If you look at this graph right here, this line, We start with full immunization. So that means you get all the possible immunizations out there for measles, mumps, rubella. These are things that you got when you were a little baby. You have a little circular scar probably on your arm from when you got your vaccinations and immunizations. In 1994, what happens in Ethiopia? About below 50% of the population is getting fully immunized. That's below 50%. So very few people in in Ethiopia are getting all the immunizations that they need to live healthy. Now, by 2003, what has happened? It's close to 80% of the population. So what does this tell us? Something that's taken place in Ethiopia where there's a great change in medical and health care. So it seems that people are able to access immunizations, get immunization for their children, for themselves, much easier. And so this is reducing the number of babies that are dying of easily prevented disease, extending the life of older people as well. Okay, let's look at another cause. Better hygiene. So our textbook definition again for better hygiene says that people are not going to contract or get diseases as frequently, right? And if you don't get as many diseases throughout your life, you're stronger, you're healthier, and so you're going to live a longer life. So how do you prevent getting a number of diseases over the course of your lifetime? By having clean water, having access to clean water, or access to clean, healthy food again. This will extend your life. It means that over your lifetime, you're probably going to have less illnesses, and so you're going to be stronger, healthier. So here's some evidence. Again, this is hard to find for Ethiopia, but we'll look at a life expectancy. So this is the average number of years that a person in Ethiopia should live once they're born. So if you were born in the 1960s, your life expectancy was around about 40 years old, right? So fairly short lives in the 1960s. But look what's happened. It was fairly flat for a number of years until about the 1980s, and then we see a great trend and increase up into about 2010. You see the life expectancy, people are living up until about 62 years old. By 2012, it's 62.97 years old. So life expectancy has gone up quite a bit, about 22 years over the course of the several decades. So that's quite a jump. So something again is happening. We could probably say that it has something to do with this better hygiene, cleaner water, better food means healthier lives. Okay, so we've talked about the causes of a high rate of population growth, high birth rate and low death rate. And so now we're going to look at something a little bit different. We're going to look at population pyramids. So this is a graph that demographers use to look at populations. It's basically, you can think of it as a picture or a snapshot of a population. It's a freeze frame of what a population looks like at a certain time. So, like I said, it's a graph. So on any graph you have an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis is the number of people. So the number of people in a population, this could be in a percentage of the population, so 2% of the population, 7%, 10%, something like that, or it could be actual numbers. It could be expressed in either way. So it could give you a number, thousands of people in a population depending on it. So you have to be a little bit careful and look at the x-axis to see what it is. Is it a percentage of the population or a number? On the y-axis you get age groups or age bands. Generally, most of the time, usually again, these are in 5-year groups. And so we'll look down here. Here's our population. I'll advance a little bit. So here's an age band. Each one of these is an age band. The first one is from 0 to 4, from 5 to 9, 10 to 14. Okay? So another part of the graph is, you'll notice that down the middle, right, is a line. It's separated into two. On the left, usually you have males, and then on the right you have females. And there are some distinctive shapes to these graphs. We'll look at this graph for Ethiopia here in a second, but one shape is the Christmas tree. And you'll see why it's a Christmas tree in just a second. Another shape we can describe as looking like a box. And a third shape we'll look at later is a cup. So just remember these three shapes: Christmas tree, box, and cup. So let's look at our example of Ethiopia. This is Ethiopia in the 1950s. Here's their population, about 18 million people. Any population pyramid can be broken up into three groups. The bottom group about 15 years, 14 to 15 years or below, is going to be called children. From about 15 and above to about 65 generally, you're going to talk about these people as being the economically active. So the economically active, it just means that they're workers. These are the people that are working. And then up at the top, from about 65 on up, are the elderly. So 65 on up until 100 or whenever people are passing away. So these two groups, the top group, elderly, and children, though, are called dependents. I'm going to write this in the middle here, and then we'll erase it later. Oops, that should be an S, dependents. Children and elderly are dependents on the economically active, right? Obviously, you're a child, so you're dependent on your parents for money, a place to live, clothing, food, all of that stuff. But elderly people can be dependents as well. They're reliant on their children possibly, or possibly the government to provide what they need to survive. Okay, so another thing to notice, let's look at specifically at this graph. What do we see? Well, down here at the bottom of the graph for Ethiopia, we see that children up until about, it looks like, what, 10 or 15 years old, there's a lot of children. So there's a huge base down here of children, but notice what happens. There's a very steep sides to both sides of this population. So what does that mean? As people are born at a young age, a lot of children are dying early, and then people are, as they get older, are not living as long. Especially, we said earlier, remember the life expectancy in the 1960s was something like 40 years old. So most people in Ethiopia in the 1950s are living to around 40s or somewhere in here, and then it becomes very few people are reaching the elderly stage up here at about 65. A very, very narrow top. It's like a pyramid. So this is, you can guess, a Christmas tree. It looks like a Christmas tree, right? A very large base, and then a very narrow top. This one is a special one because it has sloping sides. It means that many people are dying much earlier. So here is the next population pyramid for Ethiopia. Notice this is 1988. Look at the population compared to 1950, which was about 18 million people. This is 35 million people, so huge growth. Again, notice the same population graph. Left is males, right is females. This has a percentage of the population at the bottom, age bands on the y-axis. So what happens in the 1980s? We still see a very wide or thick base with lots of children down here, below about 15. But what do you see happening in the middle? In the economically active up until about 65, seems like this has widened quite a bit. So there's more economically active people surviving. So children are surviving, more children are surviving childhood into being economically active, but still life expectancy isn't that great, and there are not many people up at the top. Most people are dying much earlier than we would consider elderly age. Let's move on in time. Here's our last snapshot of the population for Ethiopia. In 2015, so now look at the total population, 98 million people, huge growth in Ethiopia. Now this one is changing. What has happened to the base? You notice that it's not quite as wide. Up at the previous one, it went all the way to the sides, basically. So what could that mean? It means fewer children. People are having possibly smaller families comparatively to other countries, but right, at least in Ethiopia, maybe not having as big as families as before. And this is, but it's still a wide base. So these children are surviving, better medical care, and moving up. So what's going to happen to these children as they move up in age, right? These children are going to get older each year, so 2016, 17, 18, and each year they get older, they move up a band, or every 5 years a band, into eventually economically active. And maybe if they continue to have children, what's going to happen? There's going to be possibly a population explosion. So great growth in the number of people in the population of Ethiopia. But still, notice up at the top, up here around, I guess around here is the line for 64, 65 and up. This is widened still a little bit, but still we don't have people reaching the upper limits of 80s, 90s like in other countries. Remember that when we look at Japan, see how many old people are in Japan. So older people are still not living really into elderly ages, but more people are living into this economically active section. Last thing, I will put my references up here, so if you're interested in any of this information, this is where I got most of it. You can go off and look at Ethiopia specifically as an example of population growth.